Hey friends, it's Rachel. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome to another edition of Fact vs. Fiction, where I talk about the real-life historical events behind a historical fiction book. This time we have Bluebird by Sharon Cameron. Now, just a fair warning, we will be talking about some pretty disturbing things in this video, so if that's not something that you want to hear, I absolutely understand. Feel free to just click away from the video. But for everybody else, let's get started. Bluebird is a young adult World War II historical fiction novel that follows Eva, who is a German immigrant who comes to America following the end of the war to find a Nazi who escaped justice. That's really all I can talk about the plot without giving away spoilers. We'll delve more into that later, and I will give you fair warning when we get there. Have you ever heard of Project Bluebird or Project MK Ultra? That's what we're going to be talking about today, and I had no knowledge of either of these things before I started reading this book. This book on its own is phenomenal. I encourage people to read it. I learned a lot from reading it, and it's also very emotional, and I just really liked the way the characters were fleshed out. They're complex. There's more to them than first meets the eye, and I just was surprised by this book because I really wasn't that excited to read it, and funnily enough, I ended up loving it. Sometimes that's just how it works out. So let's begin. What was Project Bluebird? Project Bluebird was an experiment that was begun in the concentration camps of Auschwitz and Dachau, and basically the whole point of it was to control people. Mind control. The Nazis wanted to learn to control people that they viewed as being inferior, and thus they could maybe make them less inferior if they could somehow get them to do whatever they wanted. This erasure of personality, erasure of meaning, erasure of identity was to create somebody who would go against their own moral code. For example, you could create somebody who would commit assassinations and then have no memory of having committed the attack, therefore they were immune to interrogation, and if they were captured by an enemy government, they could never betray your secrets because they simply didn't remember. It was almost like creating a split personality that was separate from who the person really was most of the time, that didn't remember their own actions and had no problem doing things that they otherwise would find repugnant. And the way that the Nazis went about this, of course, was torture and beatings. And that's horrifying, but it's not unexpected. It's exactly the kind of thing we'd expect from the Nazis. But what's even more horrifying is that Project Bluebird did not end at the end of the war. It was just getting started. Because the United States brought Nazi scientists to America at the end of the war and pardoned them of all wrongdoing, and basically said to them, "We like what you're doing, teach us your ways." Because Project Bluebird was the name that was given to this project after the war, in which Nazi scientists were brought to America to continue the horrific experiments begun in the concentration camps. And this is very disheartening. For me, personally, it was very disillusionment? I'm not sure if that's a word, but it hurts. And I knew America wasn't perfect. Obviously, no place is, especially when you're dealing with imperfect humans, but I just expected that we were better than this, you know? Countries rose up during World War II in horror, unified against what the Nazis had done, and they condemned it, and they stopped them. But they didn't, really. Not if they brought them to their own country and pardoned them and said, "Teach us what you're doing." That's pretty horrifying and also disappointing. So Project Bluebird was the name given to the project that the Americans continued. This project was done by what would come to be known as the CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency, and the way that Project Bluebird worked was America preyed not on the victims that the Nazis targeted, but on sex workers, gang members, hippies, basically people that, quote, could not fight back. And they targeted them for this mind control project. The whole goal was to create somebody who could be controlled against their will and then not remember really anything that happened. And the method that the United States decided to use, aside from electroshock therapy and psychological torture, was LSD. In fact, the CIA bought almost all of the supply of LSD in the world and brought it to America because they didn't want the Soviets getting any. And that was basically the whole motivation behind this. You had the Cold War going on, the fear of communists, the fear of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was public enemy number one, and so the CIA used that fear as justification for what they did. They believed that LSD was a drug that could be used to mind control people. Obviously, it didn't work. And because of this whole experiment, it's basically single-handedly responsible for the rise of LSD use during the 60s and on college campuses. Speaking of college campuses, those were some of the places that were used as fronts by the CIA for this project, which became known as Project Artichoke and later Project MKUltra. MKUltra was the one that really began the LSD use, and the places that were used as fronts were college campuses and universities and pharmaceutical places. And what's even more horrifying is that in places outside of the US where they would be immune to prosecution, they set up basically concentration camps, illegal detention centers where they could then experiment on political or just enemies in general, enemies of the United States, enemy agents, if you will. Not only this, but the CIA during the MKUltra phase also experimented on American citizens without their knowledge, including some of their own agents, and this resulted in at least one death. One of their agents, after giving LSD, was found dead, and the official narrative was that he committed suicide by jumping out of a window, but when his body was autopsied years later, it came out that he was actually bludgeoned in the head before he went out the window, so his death was a homicide. All of this came out during the Watergate scandal. Most of the documents pertaining to MKUltra were ordered to be destroyed, but 20,000 files were incorrectly stored and they were later found, and all of this came out, and this is why we know about this today. If those files hadn't been improperly stored, we never probably would know about this, and we only know the tip of the iceberg because only 20,000 files were saved. The rest were all destroyed. All of this came out in 1977, and there was a big hearing about it. There was a big to-do, as you would imagine. In 1977, the CIA insisted that the project was abandoned. It wasn't going on anymore, but there are some people who believe that this MKUltra project is still going on today. Some aspects of the experimentation, such as the shock therapy, which was intended to erase personality, is well documented. Other parts, including what experimentation was done to unwitting American citizens, is not fully understood to this day. The author of this book details all of this very extensively in the back of the book, which I appreciate, and one of the horrifying things about this, going back to the Nazi scientists that were never brought to justice, one of them, named Dr. Kurt Blum, was acquitted at Nuremberg in 1947, widely accepted to have happened through the interference of the CIA. Dr. Blum dropped out of sight until he was officially hired by the US in 1951, just after the dissolution of Project Bluebird, to work on a top-secret project that has never been declassified. Neither Dr. Blum nor another Nazi scientist named Dr. Plotner were ever brought to justice. For the grisly and inhumane experiments they conducted in the concentration camps, experiments believed to have been continued on American citizens under the guidance and funding of the CIA. The back of the book also details other parts of the story that play a role, including the real-life story behind the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, which features in the book itself, which I could be also completely mispronouncing. And then we come to another aspect of the story about Lebensborn and children stolen from Poland. An estimated 26,000 children were stolen from Poland during World War II by Nazis, based on the premise that children who looked Aryan must have a racially valuable bloodline and should therefore be harvested and replanted in Germany. These children were removed from their parents, sometimes brazenly kidnapped out of classrooms or their front yards, and put into group homes where they were conditioned to be German. Food deprivation, beatings, and sensory deprivation were all employed to make the children forget their previous parents and upbringing, to learn to speak German and never Polish, and to ensure that all became good German citizens who would live up to Nazi ideals. The younger the child, the more successful this program was. Children who would not conform were sent to concentration camps or murdered outright. Children who did conform were given new names, birth certificates, and were adopted by unsuspecting German families. Some of these children never forgot their Polish upbringing, even in their new German homes. They just kept it secret for survival. Others completely forgot their own background. For them, being removed from their new German parents and siblings, then returned to Polish parents they no longer recognized and whose language they could no longer speak, was a horrific trauma, and the memoirs written by some of these children, the families and their representatives tasked with removing them, are heartbreaking. It was a post-war dilemma that still has no correct answers. So, upcoming spoiler here. This is something that features in the book. It's very pivotal to the plot. Eva learns that she was one of these children who were stolen from Polish citizens. Her parents were Polish communists who were murdered in the camps. She was taken as an experiment to live with a Nazi doctor who ran the Sachsenhausen concentration camp to see if she could be made to forget her upbringing, her culture, her language, and her family, and it did succeed. Eventually, throughout the story, Eva remembers what happened to her. She remembers snatches of her family and her sibling, and it's heartbreaking because her sibling never does. It turns out that Anne-Marie, who is her friend at the beginning of the book, is actually her sister, and they're very close, and Eva sacrifices a great deal to keep Anne-Marie safe, to advocate for her, even as they both move to America and just do whatever is best for her. And it's just heartbreaking because when Anne-Marie remembers who she really is, she still doesn't remember her Polish upbringing. She still thinks of herself as a German, and more than that, a Nazi, and Eva has come to realize the truth. She knows what her father really did, who he really was, the horrifying things he was responsible for, and that he never loved her, and that he was never her father in the first place. And so Eva has completely turned her back on all the Nazi ideology that she was raised in, but Anne-Marie has not. And so the two sisters at the end of the book remain estranged from one another, and it's very tragic because I'm sure this is the kind of thing that happened in real life. Eva came to realize the truth, as painful as it was, but Anne-Marie is still living a lie. The program to steal children was part of Lebensborn, which means well of life, a program created to grow Germany's population and fill their new territories with valuable bloodlines, essential to create the master race. Group homes were established where racially valuable young women could meet with SS officers and give Hitler a good German baby. This was not only encouraged among the League of German Girls, it was a requirement for SS officers, and in occupied countries considered particularly racially valuable, like Norway, the program was forced on the female population. So all of that is just reading directly from the back of the book because it puts it far better than I could, or I could remember how to put it, and it's just really heartbreaking and also scary that this really did happen. And of course, all of this plays a role in the plot of the book. The Powell House and the American Friends Service Committee also play a feature in the book. The Powell House is where Eva is taken after she arrives in America, and the American Friends Service Committee is a program that helped get her out of Germany. These are both real things. They really existed, and I believe the American Friends Service Committee does still exist, and they helped people at the end of the war. They won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1947 in conjunction with the British Friends Service Committee for their global relief work during and after both World Wars. By the end of the war in 1945, the AFSC alone was distributing hundreds of tons of food, clothing, and medicine to Austria, Finland, France, Holland, Switzerland, Spain, Italy, Portugal, French, North Africa, China, India, and Mexico. By 1946, this included Japan after the devastation of the atomic bombs. There was also domestic work underway in Appalachia in setting up hostels for disinterred Japanese Americans, institutes and conferences focused on race and international relations, and of course services for refugees coming into America. In Germany, the AFSC was the only charitable organization allowed to remain in operation during the Third Reich because they were apolitical, and speculatively because of the fond associations with the AFSC milk trucks that were set up to feed children after World War I and were still in operation. But as the danger level rose in Germany, the AFSC quickly turned its attention to facilitating visas and travel arrangements for those under threat from the regime, particularly in getting children out of Vichy France. This work continued up until the bombing of Berlin, which meant the AFSC was on the ground post-war, immediately ready to begin relief work. The Berlin offices were damaged but not destroyed and are still housed in the same building today, and since the AFSC considered no one to be the enemy, they were one of the few organizations willing to work immediately with non-Jewish German immigrants. So the Powell House helped people coming to America with things like new clothes, resumes, finding apartments, learning American slang, and all of this was intended to ease an immigrant's transition into a new country. Another thing that's important about this is that race really didn't play a part in this relief effort, especially in a time when America was still dealing with segregation and racism. It's really impressive that this organization just didn't care. They didn't care where you came from, they were willing to help you. And that's another thing that needs to be pointed out. You know, what you've done is pretty bad when Hitler takes your attitude towards another racial group as inspiration. So America's attitude towards segregation was something that Hitler admired and helped inspire him with the concentration camps and the targeting of Jews. And that's a pretty shameful thing. Various characters in this book are also based on real life people, and it was really interesting to read that. So all in all, this is just the tip of the iceberg on all of these things. World War II is an immense thing to try to learn about. The more I read and the more I learn, the more I realize that it was more than just the battles that took place, which is often what you hear about. And I'm just immensely glad that I read this book, and that's why I recommend it to everybody. Aside from it just being a well-written and entertaining book, it's also heavy and at times hard to read, knowing that the things that it talks about really did happen. And that's why I think it's important to learn about it. I love history, and I do think that the saying that those who don't learn from it are doomed to repeat it is very true. The author goes into more detail on each of the things discussed in the back of the book than I went into here. I just didn't want to read the whole thing in this video, but I did read sections of it because, again, it basically explains it better than I could myself. And so I encourage people to read this book and also to read up more about the things that it discusses. I will leave an article linked down below about MKUltra if you'd like to read more about that. It is a very hard topic. It was very disturbing to read about, and like I said, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There is far more to learn about here, but I am grateful to know the truth. I'm glad that I learned that this happened because it's always better to know than not know. And that was another thing that this book explores that I really appreciated. It's kind of a motto that Eva lives life by. She has learned some really horrifying things about the past and her life, and what she believed to be true turned out to be just lies. But as she says, it is better to know. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!